I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Today's episode: Echoes of Silence. James stepped off the train, the familiar scent of his hometown mingling with the acrid remnants of smoke that clung to his uniform. The townspeople had gathered to welcome him, their faces a blend of joy for James and sorrow for the young men who wouldn't be returning. He knew he was one of the lucky ones, so he forced a smile, but it felt heavy on his lips. And then he saw her. Mary, his young wife, stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. She clasped her hands to her face and rushed towards him, their little son Tommy in tow. Tommy's small face lit up at the sight of his father. "James, you're home," Mary whispered, her voice trembling with emotion as she threw her arms around him. He stiffened slightly, the intimacy feeling foreign after months of war. But then he relaxed into her embrace, whispering back, "I missed you, Mary." "Papa!" Tommy's voice was bright and eager as he tugged at James' sleeve. "Did you bring me anything?" James knelt down, his hands trembling as he ruffled Tommy's hair. I'm here, buddy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. But as he looked into Tommy's innocent eyes, a wave of guilt flashed over him. What could he give this child when he felt so broken inside? That evening, the house buzzed with well-wishers, the clinking of glasses and the aroma of home-cooked meals. James smiled and nodded, doing his best to engage, though he kept his distance from the children who eagerly peppered him with questions about the war. From across the room, Mary watched him, her heart aching as she noticed the shadows in his eyes and the way he flinched at sudden movements. Her husband was no longer the carefree man who had left for the front lines. A sudden crashing sound shattered the din of laughter and conversation. Mary recognized it immediately, a plate hitting the floor. She turned to find James standing rigid, his face pale, eyes wide, staring off into the distance as if he were seeing something far away and terrifying. His body began to tremble uncontrollably. "Everyone, I'm so sorry, but I think it's time we call it a night," Mary said, her voice steady yet urgent. The guests, sensing the gravity of the moment, quickly gathered their things and offered hurried goodbyes, their faces etched with concern and understanding. As the door closed behind the last guest, Mary rushed to James' side. "James, it's okay. It's just us now," she whispered, wrapping her arms around him. She felt the tension slowly start to drain from his body, but the shadows in his eyes remained. The next afternoon, as Mary hung the laundry on the line, she noticed James standing in the garden, staring intently at a patch of dirt. His hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly, and his breathing was shallow and rapid. Mary paused, watching him from a distance, her heart heavy with worry. How do I reach him, she wondered. How do I bring him back from this abyss? Summoning her courage, she approached him cautiously, her voice soft and soothing. "James, are you all right?" she asked gently. He blinked, his eyes slowly focusing on her as if seeing her for the first time. I, I thought I saw something," he muttered, shaking his head as if to clear away the haunting images. Mary nodded, her heart aching for him. She had read about hallucinations and flashbacks that could transport him back to the front lines in an instant. She reached out and gently took his hand, grounding him in the present. "It's okay, James. You're here. With me," she whispered, hoping her words could offer some comfort. That night, James woke up screaming, the sound piercing the quiet of their home. Mary bolted upright, rushing to his side. Her hands were gentle on his shoulders as she tried to calm him. "James, it's just a nightmare. You're safe," she whispered, her voice trembling with concern. But James' eyes were wild with fear, his body drenched in sweat. He pushed her away, stumbling out of the bed and pressing himself against the wall as if trying to escape an unseen foe. The commotion woke Tommy, who stood in the doorway clutching his bear tightly. His eyes were wide with confusion and fear. "Papa?" he called softly, his voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't understand why Papa was so scared. He wanted to help but didn't know how. James looked at his son, the terror slowly fading from his eyes. He sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry." Mary gathered Tommy in her arms, her own tears falling silently. "It's all right, James. We're here. We'll get through this together." As Mary watched Tommy stare longingly at his father, her heart ached with the weight of unspoken questions. What is he thinking? Is he scared? Does he simply miss the man his father used to be? The rest of the night was spent comforting James, her heart aching with each sob that racked his body. When the morning light filtered through the curtains, she found him sitting by the window, staring out at the empty street. The dark circles under his eyes were a stark reminder of the sleepless night they had just endured, and how many more were to come. She sat beside him, taking his hand in hers, offering silent support. Over dinner that evening, Mary could hardly taste the food on her plate, her mind consumed by the conversation she knew they needed to have. The clinking of utensils and the quiet hum of the evening only heightened her anxiety. She glanced at James, his face etched with fatigue and the unspoken weight of his experiences. "James," she began softly, her voice steady but laced with concern. Her heart pounded in her chest. "We need to talk to Dr. Andrews. We need to understand what's happening to you." James froze, his fork hovering above his plate. The room fell silent, the tension between them palpable. He looked at her, his eyes weary and filled with a storm of emotions: fear, shame, and the remnants of the man he used to be. For a moment, it felt as if time stood still, the weight of her words pressing down on them both. Mary held her breath, bracing for resistance or denial. Finally, James's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long, shaky breath. His voice was barely above a whisper, carrying the exhaustion of countless sleepless nights. "Hi, Mary," he said, his tone resigned but tinged with a glimmer of hope. "Let's talk to Dr. Andrews." Mary reached out and grasped his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. As their fingers intertwined, she felt a flicker of connection, a fragile but vital thread that promised they could face this together. A week later, Mary and James sat in Dr. Andrews' office. Mary detailed James' symptoms, her voice steady but tinged with desperation. Dr. Andrews listened intently, nodding occasionally as he took notes. Finally, he leaned forward, his eyes filled with understanding. "James, can you tell me what haunts you the most?" he asked gently. James looked down, his hands trembling. "We tried our best. We just couldn't save them," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Save whom?" Dr. Andrews prompted, his tone soft and encouraging. "That family," James replied, his voice breaking. "They had two children, two little girls. I was on sentry duty with two other lads, Anders and William. Anders nearly shot 'em, thinking they were Germans sneaking through no man's land. They didn't speak English. Dawn was breaking at any moment. The Germans could have spotted them and opened fire. We realized the danger quickly. Anders dropped his rifle and ran out to no man's land. We shouted for him to stop, that it was too perilous, but he went anyway. He guided that family back to our trenches. The relief we felt was immense. When our relief came a few minutes later, we began to lead the family back towards the supply trenches. That's when what?" Dr. Andrews asked, sensing James was reliving the moment in his mind. "That's when his shell dropped. It was so loud, so violent. I've seen horrors on the battlefield, but this was the worst. That man, his wife, their two little girls, they're all dead. So was Anders. William was nowhere to be seen. Perhaps he was wounded and made it to the aid station. I don't know. But that family, they haunt me every day, every night. They haunt me. Dr. Andrews nodded, allowing the silence to stretch between them, giving James the space to gather himself. It's important to remember that you did what you could in an impossible situation, he said finally. Survivor's guilt is common, but it wasn't your fault. After a few moments of silence, Dr. Andrews gently suggested, James, why don't you step outside for a moment? I'd like to speak with Mary. Alone. James nodded and slowly got up, his movements heavy with weariness. Once he had left the room, Dr. Andrews turned to Mary, his expression serious yet compassionate. I'm afraid James is suffering from what we now call shell shock, Dr. Andrews explained gently. It's a common condition among soldiers who've seen intense combat. Therapy and support can help, but it will take time. Mary nodded, absorbing the information. What can I do to help him? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Be patient and supportive. Encourage him to talk about his experiences, but don't push too hard. It might also be beneficial for both of you to seek counseling, Dr. Andrews advised. Remember, recovery is a gradual process. He'll need you by his side. Mary took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of relief and determination. Thank you, Dr. Andrews. We'll do whatever it takes. As she stepped outside to join James, she resolved to be the anchor he needed, no matter how turbulent the waters ahead might be. Mary immersed herself in reading everything she could find about shell shock, determined to learn how to support James without overwhelming him. She pored over books and medical journals, seeking out any pamphlets or articles she could find in the local library, absorbing each piece of information with unwavering resolve. Sensing the mounting strain on her daughter, Margaret, Mary's ever nurturing mother, moved into their small family home. With her gentle demeanor and innate ability to bring calm to any situation, Margaret quickly became an anchor for the family. She took over many of the daily tasks, from cooking hearty meals to ensuring Tommy stuck to his routines. Her presence allowed Mary to focus on supporting James without neglecting her own well being. Margaret's understanding and warmth provided much needed solace during this challenging time. She would sit with Tommy, reading him stories and playing games, her laughter echoing through the house and creating pockets of joy amidst the tension. In the evenings, she would offer a listening ear to Mary, sharing her own wisdom and experiences and reminding her that they were not alone in this journey. With Margaret's steady presence and Mary's newfound knowledge, they began to create a more supportive environment for James, one filled with patience, love, and hope. Weeks turned into months, marked by their consistent weekly visits to Dr. Andrews. Each session was a small step forward, a blend of difficult conversations and therapeutic exercises designed to help James confront his trauma. Mary noticed the gradual changes in James. Initially, his improvement was barely perceptible, a slight decrease in the frequency of his nightmares, a faint glimmer of hope in his eyes. Over time, these small victories accumulated. He began to sleep more soundly, and his once trembling hands grew steadier. Conversations that used to be terse and filled with unspoken pain slowly transformed into more open and honest exchanges. James started to engage more with Tommy, playing with him in the yard and reading him bedtime stories, activities he had previously found too overwhelming. He also began to take tentative steps back into the world outside their home, joining Mary for short walks and even occasionally visiting the local cafe. Mary's diligent research and unwavering support, combined with Dr. Andrews' expertise, were creating a foundation for James' recovery. Margaret's constant presence, too, provided an additional layer of stability and comfort, making the home a sanctuary of healing. Though the road ahead was still long and uncertain, the steady progress gave them all a renewed sense of hope and determination. James was not just surviving, He was beginning to reclaim pieces of himself that had been lost to the war. One sunny afternoon, a few months into their journey of recovery, James was outside repairing a fence. The rhythmic sound of hammering, however, transported him back to the trenches. The deafening roar of artillery, the cries of his comrades, and the acrid smell of gunpowder overwhelmed his senses. He could see the face of Anders twisted and mangled as he lay motionless in the dirt. And the family, that family they tried so hard to save. A shudder ran through him, and he paused, gripping the hammer tightly as he fought to push the memories away, reminding himself that he was no longer in that hellish place. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a firecracker echoed through the air, snapping James back to the present. He dropped his hammer, his body freezing in place as panic set in. Mary, who had been tending to the garden nearby, rushed to his side. "James, it was just a firecracker," she said urgently, her eyes locking onto his, filled with concern and unwavering support. James looked into Mary's eyes, finding solace in her presence. "I know," he whispered, trying to steady his breathing. "I have to get better for them. I can't let the war take everything from me," he thought. Tommy, who had been helping his father with the fence, approached quietly and handed James the hammer he had dropped. James took it, but found his grip faltering, and the hammer skipped from his hand again. Seeing this, Margaret emerged from the house, her eyes filled with understanding. She placed a hand on James' shoulder, grounding him further. James took a deep breath, turned to Tommy, forcing a smile. "Tommy, go get our gloves. Let's go have a catch." Thank you for listening to World War I Stories, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. I'm Henny B, your host and storyteller. Please like and subscribe, and maybe even leave a review for us wherever you find your podcasts. And join us again for more World War I stories.